On this week's 51%, we speak with divorce attorney Renee Bauer about the healing process post-divorce and how preparing for the worst may actually help preserve your marriage.
It's getting ahead of the things that often create conflict and break down the relationship. Often when resentment starts to fester, it's really hard to undo that.
We also hear from intimacy coach Beth Darling about the 5 kinds of intimacy and how couples can better connect on every level. I'm Jesse King. It's all up next on 51%.
I was standing around like one of those girls I had seen in a movie. The whole world was a movie back then. I had my sunglasses on, I wanted to be seen without seeing shy Lolita. I wasn't really in it, I didn't really get it.
You're listening to 51%, a WAMC production dedicated to women's issues and experiences. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jesse King. This week we're revisiting a frequent topic on this show. We've broached the subject of divorce with multiple guests over the years on everything from the nuts and bolts of it, depending on your state, and how to navigate the process when kids are involved. To be clear, I'm very much in favor of love here at 51%. No one's saying marriage isn't a wonderful thing, but it is important to talk about divorce because, one, there's a lot of stigma around it, despite the divorce rate, complicated as it is, being relatively high here in the U.S., and 2, studies suggest women are more likely to file for divorce than men. Our main guest today has a unique perspective on divorce and has been helping women on both the legal side of things and with personal advice for years. Renee Bauer is an award-winning divorce attorney, motivational speaker, and author who founded her own family law firm called Happy Even After in Hamden, Connecticut. Her latest book, called She Who Wins, encourages readers to drop the limitations that sometimes come from being raised a good girl and start living their lives to the fullest. Bauer says she never saw herself becoming a divorce attorney. She actually set out to work in criminal law. But over time, she saw how divorce could impact every aspect of a client's life. She says it's a period of total transition, a period that she herself has undergone twice now. But that doesn't mean you should be ashamed of it or give up on love. In fact, divorce doesn't have to be a traumatic experience. In a lot of ways, for men and women alike, it's a clean slate. And being what she calls divorce savvy could actually help solidify your marriage in the long run.
Being divorce savvy means getting really comfortable having uncomfortable conversations. And I mean, this can really be anything in life, but it really applies to marriage in particular. So often a lot of what women do is they want to people please, and they've blurred boundaries, and it's easier to keep the peace, and so they're not having conversations about things maybe such as money. If weren't the ones who have handled money in the relationship, and now they go into a marriage and they're not talking about money and they're just handing it off to their partner, that money's often a cause of a lot of discord in marriages. So having those conversations ahead of time can actually prevent the conflict later on. Having conversations about, as it relates to money, spending habits, if someone's a spender or saver, having conversations about needs, what each of you needs from a relationship to feel connected to the other person. It's not always physical. Some people have just a need for touch, or some people have a need for acts of service. And really being clear on how each of you operates can save your relationship as well. So it's getting ahead of the things that often create conflict and break down the relationship, and talking about them to maybe you could possibly avoid it. And often when resentment starts to fester in a relationship, it's really hard to undo that. So when you're having those open conversations, even when they're hard, and even when your spouse disagrees with you, you can really prevent that resentment from seeping in.
I guess, how do you know when a marriage can't be preserved? What are you seeing in the couples that you work with that's usually sort of, I guess, the straw that breaks the camel's back or the deciding factor?
Yeah, I can't say it's one thing. Often when someone comes and sees me, they already have an answer and they're looking for validation one way or the other.
Mhm.
And they're looking for exactly the type of question that you asked. They're looking for something, right? They want me to say, well, this had to have happened, and now is time, or this particular situation gives you permission to go and say that you can't salvage it. But usually people already have a strong feeling one way or the other, whether they want to hold on, or whether things are so far gone that it's time to let go, or whether they want to do a little bit of work with some expert help. And so it's never one thing. It's never just infidelity that causes a breakdown, because there are a lot of people where infidelity happens in a marriage and they can actually keep the relationship together. So there are other factors, but it's usually what's happening inside of you. And when someone is already checked out and they no longer feel connected to that person, and there is a ton of that resentment, and they don't even like being in the same room, or they feel like they're walking on eggshells around that person, it's really hard to keep that marriage together because they're not there emotionally, mentally, physically. Every piece of the marriage has already disintegrated.
Let's talk a little bit about, I guess, picking the process that works best for you then. If you decide you want a divorce, and I guess we should note that your firm is in Connecticut, correct?
It is, yes.
Okay. The actual like legal process and like the things you should be keeping in mind can change from state to state. But, if you decide you want a divorce, I guess what should you know and do before you file, and how do you pick an attorney?
Education is always the first thing. I always say when someone comes in, I'm like, well, if I'm the first person you're meeting with, the first attorney, make sure you go meet with a couple others, because everyone operates in a different way. Everyone has a different style and personality in different types of practice, such as the mediation practice or the collaborative practice, which is ways to keep your divorce out of court. Litigation is the more traditional way of having two adversarial attorneys represent. And sometimes that means you go to court and you fight it out. And sometimes that means you go to court and you still end up in an agreement. It doesn't always mean that you have to have a trial, but it's a little bit more of the formal way of things happening through the court system. So first, understand what options you have available to you and whether your spouse would be willing to do some sort of alternative dispute resolution, such as mediation, and then find the attorney that is best aligned for that process, because not every lawyer is a mediator. Not every lawyer has been trained in the collaborative process. Some lawyers have reputations for being, so-called pit bulls, but that's an insult to my sweet pit bull. So, just being a snake or being ultra aggressive. And that may not be the lawyer that the type of personality that you want in your family, in your finances, in your emotional state. You may want someone who has a more conciliatory approach and wants to work with the other side. So you really have to make sure it's a personality match. So it's worth spending the money on a consultation if they charge for a consultation, reading some books just to have an understanding. I have an online class, for example, called the D course, that really walks people through all the things that they have to think about. So it's self-educate yourself, it just so that you can start to get really comfortable with all of the pieces, and then find the attorney that is the best fit for you. Just because someone recommended someone to you doesn't mean that they're going to be the right one. You really trust your gut on that one.
We've been talking mostly, I guess, from the perspective of the person filing who is presumably ready to move forward. But what if you're the person who's catching up?
Oh, it's so tough because when you're a few steps behind that emotional journey, it feels extremely hurtful that your partner has already checked out or is ready to move forward at a quicker pace. We just don't know, they went through their own process. They just weren't filling the other person in on that. So, I always say go to counseling. This is a great time if someone has not gone to any sort of counseling or therapy, mental health professional, to do that, because they can help you process all of those feelings, because you do go through so much. You go through the grief, you go through the hurt, the anger, the defeatedness, like all of those things come in waves. And often what happens is it spills out into how you interact with your spouse. And it just makes things a little bit uglier. It could cause higher attorney fees, which no one wants. And so having an outlet and someone to talk to is always the best, because your lawyer's not that person either. And your friends are, sometimes they make things a little worse, and they'll add some fuel to those flames. And sometimes they aren't the best person to always go to. So have someone who can actually sit with you and talk about your feelings, and just to help you work through them.
Now, we haven't really touched on yet about, what to do when kids are involved. I mean, that's a sort of broad question, but I guess if you had some general advice for parents going through the divorce process, what would be some things that you would like them to keep in mind?
So it is not the divorce that causes the things in kids that you will often see, where you talk about kids are damaged after a divorce or harmed, or there's some certain studies that say they have a higher substance abuse rate. But those aren't, it's not the divorce that causes that, it's the conflict. And so there's plenty of children who live in intact homes where the conflict is so high that they also are impacted by all of that. So what I like to remind parents is really insulate your kids from what's happening throughout the divorce process. They don't need to know about the argument that you and your soon to be ex had about the parenting plan. And they don't need to know about the money or how the house is going to be divided, and how much alimony. So don't overshare, because kids don't need that burden. They just want to love both of their parents and they want to feel really safe. So it's continuously reassure them that while things might look different, they still have two parents who love them and two parents who are going to be totally involved in their lives, and give them that type of reassurance. And just catch yourself every time you find yourself disparaging your spouse when your kids are hearing that. That's putting extra stress and burden on them. And that's what you want to protect them from.
Okay. Now I want to take some time to, talk about, you've got a new book out called
do.
She Who Wins. It's not necessarily about divorce, but, more about like how women can embrace themselves and kind of take control and overcome adversity and stuff. You mentioned earlier that, a lot of us have like that impulse to people please, to be good girls. A lot of us are recovering good girls. I certainly am. What does that hard work look like of shedding that impulse and, embracing more of what you want out of your life?
Yeah. So this book, I'm so excited to share this book. It came from the result of spending all of this time working with in the divorce world and working with a lot of women who didn't recognize their self-worth, or were putting their own dreams on hold because of their kids or their spouse, or they weren't willing to have hard conversations, or they had goals that they said, well, I'll take care of them later when the kids are older, or when I'm not busy driving them around. And so I realized, I'm like, wow, like women are often doubting themselves and putting everyone else on a priority list and themselves at the bottom. And that was impacting how they showed up in the world, how they showed up as a spouse, as a parent, as a coworker. Everything else trickled down because they were putting themselves last. And so that's what this book is all about. It's really helping women to tap into what they need to, their intuition, so that they can make decisions that feel really aligned and really intuitive and things that they've always wanted to do. But more important than that is really identify the excuses that have held them back for all of these years. And, that could look like I'll do it when the kids are older, when I have more money, when I lose 10 pounds. There's a million excuses that we make that tell us not to go for whatever it is that's living in our heart. It could be leaving the relationship or starting the business or moving across country, like whatever it is for them, their own unique set of dreams and goals and visions that they have. It's identifying those excuses so that they no longer hold them back, and then taking action. Because we can dream all we want, but if we actually don't implement action, then nothing more happens. And that's where we stay stuck. So it's about trusting ourselves in doing it, even when it's terrifying and even when it's really hard. Because when you do that, you'll always win. And that's why it's called She Who Wins, because when you follow your intuition and you don't allow excuses to hold you back and you take action, no matter the outcome, you'll win, because you're going after something and you're refusing to accept the status quo.
You've got a whole chapter that's also devoted, to rejection, and I guess, to not meeting your goals, and how that can actually be, a good thing. What would you consider some of your proudest rejections? What would you like people to learn from those?
Oh, I love this question. I love the concept of rejection, because that means you're actually doing something. So my proudest rejection moments are the 113 rejections I got before I got a literary agent. And so when I say that, to think about it this way, I had 113 emails come into my inbox that said, no, thank you. This book isn't for me. Or, of course, I internalized it at the beginning. It was like, you're not a good enough writer. That's how I took it. But it was 113 rejections before I got the one yes. And then we moved on to countless publisher rejections before we got the one yes. And it's every single one of those rejections led me to the perfect agent and the perfect publisher. And I wouldn't change it any other way. And quite frankly, had I got the book deal when I thought I wanted it, it would not be the book that it is. I wasn't ready to write that book 3 years ago. It would not have, I wasn't ready to be as vulnerable as I was in those pages. So the timing was perfect. And, that rejection was just redirection for a better time, a better publisher, a better agent. And that's the journey that rejection leads you on.
And I guess any final or broader advice for, couples trying to keep it going or, just trying to navigate the storm?
Yeah. So take the time to put your phones down, turn them over, turn the TV off, and have a conversation about how each of you are doing in that moment. Things that maybe haven't been spoken, like create a safe space to say, no matter what is said in this space, no one's going to yell, no one's going to get defensive. We're just going to listen to each other. And if you create that little environment that is so safe for you each to express yourselves and be heard, you can break down walls and you can start to reconnect and leave that feeling that much closer to that person. And I think so often we go by life and it's so quick and we're always running to get to work and get to the gym and get to the next, get the kids where they need to be, that we don't slow down and pause and just look at our partner and say, what do you need? What have I not maybe been providing you because I'm not paying attention, and allowing yourselves to be vulnerable in that way. And I think those are the things that those type of conversations are what save relationships and marriages.
Renee Bauer is a divorce attorney out of her firm Happy Even After in Hampton, Connecticut. Her new book is She Who Wins, Ditch Your Inner Good Girl, Overcome Uncertainty, and Win at Your Life. It's out now through Urano World, and you can learn more about Bauer and her work at FamilyLawyerCT.com. Renee, thanks for joining us today.
This was great. Thank you for having me.
Our next guest is dead set on making sure her clients never have to go to court in the first place. A former divorce attorney herself, Beth Darling flipped 15 years into her career to become a life coach specializing in relationships, sex, and intimacy, helping couples reconnect and strengthen their relationships. Now, there's a lot of reasons why a marriage might end. What we're about to discuss doesn't apply to situations where abuse is involved. But Darling finds it tragic when a divorce basically amounts to the spark died, or we just drifted apart. She says intimacy is what gives love substance and keeps it alive. Learning how to create it is vital to any long-term relationship. But contrary to what you might think, intimacy amounts to a lot more than just sex. In her new guide, The 5 Kinds of Intimacy, How to Keep Your Love Alive, Darling offers advice on how you can identify your needs, communicate them, and create intimacy with your partner on every level.
The way I define intimacy with respect to relationships, it's a state that results from connection, closeness, familiarity, exposure, or proximity that is highly personal, so much so that it's very likely to cause a feeling of vulnerability. That's the big, broad overview. Then from there are the 5 kinds of intimacy that I think are necessary for the strongest, most likely chance to survive, keep your love alive for a lifetime. Those 5 kinds are physical, emotional, sexual, romantic, and spiritual. I think that all 5 are actually equally important, and none, it's like sugar and protein. If you need protein, it doesn't matter how much sugar you eat, it's not going to fulfill the need for protein. So you might have a relationship with sex. But if you don't have emotional intimacy, if you don't have romantic intimacy, and we can talk about what that is, sex is not going to be enough to keep you going long term. It's just not. But neither is just emotional. So you know how many couples get divorced and what they say, and this is so shocking. They say the other person, they might even be their best friend. They're so good. They didn't do anything wrong. There just wasn't there. I wasn't in love anymore. I love them, but I'm not in love anymore. That's the most frustrating, horrible thing, to have couples who start out so good, so strong, who have love, who have friendship, respect, and trust, and don't know how to keep that even they might be having sex, but they don't know how to keep that romantic intimacy alive. And romantic intimacy is what takes sex out of the realm of what I call BMS, boring married sex. You don't have to be married to have BMS. It's the same thing. You know exactly what's going to happen over and over again. Romantic intimacy is when you change that, when you add excitement, energy, ambiance, and adventure, laughter, even a little bit of nervousness, maybe, anticipation. And that excitement gives you that romantic intimacy, amps up your sexy intimacy, which then, feeds. And so it's all circular.
Not to generalize too much, but how do you feel intimacy, I guess, differs between men and women? People talk a lot about how guys have difficulty opening up emotionally. The stereotype on the other end is that women are, less open about sex. In your work, has there been any credence to that, or are we conditioned differently?
Yeah, so let's talk. First of all, we never wrap everybody in, right? You're a woman, I'm a woman. There's a zillion differences between us, but there are some similarities in ways that we grow up. And we're not trying to pigeonhole somebody. We're just trying to sort of explain. And I say the only way we can change things is by recognizing where we've come from first. That's how we then know. So without trying to pigeonhole anybody, I think that heterosexual relationships are actually set up to fail, quite frankly, because men are taught to avoid emotional intimacy until and unless they're in the midst of sexy intimacy. That's when they can be like, oh, I love you. Oh, you make me feel so good. I never want to leave you. That depth of feeling is only allowed to escape in certain circumstances for most men. But women, on the other hand, we're taught exactly the opposite. We are taught to avoid sexual intimacy until and unless we get our emotional needs met. And then worse than that is that we're taught to then give sex as a reward, not for our own pleasure, but for theirs. But then ironically, once we're partnered, whether we're living together or we're married, civil unions, anything that you want to talk about, once we're in that committed phase, the tables turn. And then the expectation is that emotional intimacy has to be part of the deal. You hear anybody saying, oh, my partner won't talk to me, won't even say hello to me for 3 weeks. You'd be like, no, get that person out. What a jerk. They're selfish. But it's totally okay and acceptable for people to say, oh, my partner won't have sex with me for weeks or months on end. It's like, oh, there's other stuff going on. That becomes trite, banal, trivial. But sexual intimacy, like I said, is just as important as emotional intimacy. And so we have to find ways for people to overcome those natural instincts and to fuel where they do connect well, to start encouraging further growth in the areas that are harder for women, learning how to enjoy sexual intimacy, how to feel. I teach women how to feel loved with their clothes off, loved, respected, trusted, valued, and men to feel that way with their clothes on. But I want to make sure, right? Anybody out there who's got, whether you're in, LGBTQ plus, if you're throuples, right? All of this still applies. And the problem also is, let's just say, if those generalities that I suggest are kind of true about women with emotional, well, you can imagine maybe if we have 2 lesbians and they're both really comfortable with emotional intimacy, but they don't necessarily, they struggle a little bit with the sexual intimacy. That would be something they would need to work on. They're not going to do well just kind of ignoring that one. On the other hand, the flip side, if we've got 2 men in a relationship, sex is still going to leave you hungry for emotional intimacy. So you're going to have to get there. These play out no matter who we are or what we are. And if you are somebody who none of these stereotypes apply to you, then hooray, that's awesome. That's fantastic. Help the rest of us get over them, right? Help us so that our children aren't faced with growing up in the same ways.
So when it comes to women then and the ways that we are conditioned to have a certain amount of shame around sexual intimacy, what advice do you have for working through that, I guess?
That's where spiritual intimacy comes in. Spiritual intimacy is the idea, the knowing, the believing that you are doing exactly the right thing with the right person at the right time, i.e. that it's good for you, good for them, good for your family, good for the world at large. I say even blessed by the divine, whatever your version of the divine is, because it's got nothing to do with religion. But for many women, we've been taught that enjoying sexual pleasure is not something that is good. It doesn't make us, my one client told me she felt like if she did certain things her husband asked, that he wouldn't respect her She thought that good girls didn't do this, that her pastor would disapprove. And how could she be a good Christian woman and literally love her husband this way? Once she got comfortable with the idea that in her mind, she said, like, she's always loved her husband, but now she's learned to loving him. And she thinks that brings her closer to Jesus. The more she loves her husband, the closer she is to the divine. For many women, it's going back and trying to figure out what it is that holds you back. What are true, deep down, we don't want to admit it, but what are our preconceived, those insidious views of sexuality and pleasure that are there? Because that's usually the first place to start. And then sometimes it's even, well, if there's laundry on the bed that needs to be folded, then I can't enjoy it. If the kids are next door, then I'm worried about them. If it's that the door's not locked. So if we just start putting all those down, we tick those off the list, and suddenly we find, okay, now we're ready. Now we've got spiritual intimacy. Now let's talk and start getting sexy and see what happens and see how much more we enjoy it.
If you're feeling like there's a lack of intimacy in your relationship of any kind, how do you start having that conversation without insulting or shutting down the person that you're with? Because that's a difficult thing to have to come up and say, like, hey, this isn't working for me right now.
I think it's important to start with a positive, right? We never want to put somebody on a defensive. So if we say this isn't good, we're immediately, the other person's on the defensive. That doesn't help. The same way I say with the 5 kinds of intimacy, start with the ones that come easiest to you. I say, start with your partner and think about what's good, what's really good between you two, or what did you used to love to do that you're not doing now? And just suggest that. So start creating some more connection in different ways. Maybe it's, if it's physical, if holding hands used to be good, if it was that you used to sit closer together watching TV, even though now you don't want to watch what they're watching on TV, just start sitting next to them, squishing up. Watch what they want for a little bit. Let things sort of start building and growing so that you're both feeling more comfortable. And then talk about, okay, how could we do more? What would you like more from me? And you can even ask your partner, think back and tell me about a couple of the times in our marriage or relationship where you have felt the closest to me. When did you feel the most safe, the most treasured, that we had the most emotional intimacy? Or when was the best sexy? Or what was the most romantic time? And romantic, by the way, for men is often, you have to say, what was the hottest? They're not taught to appreciate romance. So it's what's hot. That's the same thing. Open up those kinds of conversations and ask, what would you like from me? That's a good way to start getting that feedback without somebody being defensive. And then at some point, they're feeling good. And then they'll turn around generally and say, or you say, hey, I'm so glad this has been so good. I love doing this. What do you think about blah, blah, blah? I'd really like this from you. And when we ask, instead of pointing out what the failures have been in the past, we're much more likely to get something better in the future.
Well, Beth, thanks so much for taking the time. Is there any final advice that you want our listeners to know before we go?
I think it's what my client said, that love isn't enough. They'd been together 25 something years. She really did love him, vice versa. Love isn't enough, but to learn to loving someone, that's what the 5 kinds of intimacy is about. And that's what's going to get you over and over and over again.
Beth Darling is an intimacy coach and relationship expert. Her latest book is The 5 Kinds of Intimacy, How to Keep Your Love Alive. You can learn more about her work at bethdarling.com. Beth, thanks so much for coming on.
You are so welcome. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, Jessie.
You've been listening to 51%. 51% is a national production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio in Albany, New York. It's produced and hosted by me, Jessie King. Our associate producer is Jody Cowan, and our theme is Lolita by the Albany-based artist Girl Blue. Just a reminder that you can listen to 51% anytime at WAMCpodcast.org or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can stay in the loop with all of our shows through our weekly newsletter, Airwaves. Just sign up at WAMC.org. We hope you'll join us next week. Until then, I'm Jessie King for 51%.
I was every single girl, I was nobody else, I was so sure of myself. I was 15 and a half, he was a hollow laugh. And I lost my cool somewhere along the way. At night and down the hallway, I had to learn how to look away. I lost my cool, no electricity, hot take it.